Coming up on this week's episode of TechSnap, Google has confirmed that hundreds of Gmail accounts were snooped on, and the people involved are not too happy about it. Plus, the cookie catastrophe continues in the UK, and we'll share the brutal details of it with you. Then after that, find out about the hack that led to the leak of the truth about Tupac. Plus, it's a whole new batch of awesome audience questions and our answers. All that and more on this week's episode of TechSnap. Hi everybody, and welcome back to TechSnap. My name is Chris, and the guy on the other line there, that's Alan Jew. Hey there, Alan.
Hey,
Now, folks, Alan is the local handy guy around here in the IRC chat rooms over at JupiterBroadcasting.com. Not only is he the vice president of Scale Engine, but he's all around just a good guy and a lot of geeky knowledge just rattling around in that brain of his. And he gets on here and digs into the tech stories with us. And there was something a little new we've been doing recently is getting viewer questions and our answers. And we have got a big batch again today, and something kind of new is somebody sent us in their war story, which is awesome. I mean, Alan, I did not expect that, and I was a little worried. It could have been a little long, but you were able to get the good bits out of it. It was like the perfect length. Mm-hmm. And so before we just move on, and before I forget, I wanted to give a solid plug to our email address. So send in your questions or your tech topics, so things you think we should cover, or even better, your war stories, to TechSnap@JupiterBroadcasting.com, and we'll try to feature those in a future episode. And something else we're going to try a little new here, Alan, is before we move on, just a little bit ago on the live stream, you were talking about a new app you found, and I know that us geeks love these things that make our systems run a little better for us. So do you want to share that before we go? Give a little app pick to the folks at home?
Sure. I found this little app on SourceForge, actually, called Mini-Me, and it's an app for Windows, and it's written in a little scripting language, but it's a regular app. And what I use it for is wrangling the PuTTY sessions that I have open.
Oh.
I usually have somewhere between 30 and 50. It's a lot of Windows. And I had an app that did it for XP, but that app didn't work in Windows 7. And so I've been suffering since January trying to work with PuTTY tray, which just puts each individual PuTTY session in the system tray. The problem there was finding the right one to get it back. I had to mouse over each one and wait until the right server name popped up.
So with Mini-Me, you can minimize things down to a menu in your system tray, basically?
Right, so it's one icon in the system tray. You click it once, and it pops up a list of all the windows you've hidden. And then you click the one you want, and it opens it back up.
That's pretty slick, dude.
Customizable keyboard shortcut, I use Control-Shift-Z, and it sends it back, and it disappears. It just makes it much easier to manage. You know, I have all these connections open. Some of them are running top or endload or whatever I need it to run.
I could see it just being handy to just to manage all my instant message windows and email and stuff. Just kind of just get all that out of the way.
Yeah, it can be handy for that too.
Very cool. So that's Mini-Me, and we'll put a link to it in the Mini-Me, like the Dr. Evil guy. We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
It's open source and under an MIT license, so it's free.
Nice. You said you had to compile it.
I recompiled it because by default it has a limit of 20 windows, and I needed more.
Oh, that's what the thing was. Oh, I see. I see. I gotcha.
Yeah.
You could just go multiple menus, dude. Maybe, I'm just saying.
No, but that
would defeat the point, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right, now we've got a batch of news to get through before we go on to the new Q&A and the viewer submitted war story. And this first story affects me personally. I actually, I'll let you introduce the story, Alan, then I'll share a little bit about how it affected me. But it's regarding the what was before alleged hack attempts by China on Gmail, but as now actually it's been confirmed, hasn't it?
Yes. So a number of people have had their Gmail accounts hacked from China and sometimes from other places. But specifically, Google wanted to stress the point that there's no known issue with Gmail itself. In all of these cases, the people had the account's password and logged into the Gmail. And
that's what they say.
It seems most of these people were the victims of a phishing scam. But some of the victims included very senior U.S. government officials, people in the military, journalists, and political dissidents, and so on. As the type of people that would be targeted by the Chinese government. But specifically, a lot of these people should know better than to fall for phishing scams.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you recall the story that broke? It might have been towards the end of last year or the beginning of this year, that the Google authentication mechanism, that the code that they used when Google was compromised by supposedly hackers from China, that the code that Google uses for the Google authentication system was taken. Do you recall that story?
I don't. But
Okay.
I do remember there was a problem with one of their other authentication systems more recently, and they gave a talk about it at Google I/O, but I didn't watch that talk.
After that story broke, about 3 days after that story broke, I got now this is just anecdotal, but I got a prompt in my Gmail when I logged in saying that my account had been accessed from a suspicious location and that they needed to confirm who I was. So I couldn't go to my Gmail. I had to confirm who I was and put in some of my secret information and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And this actually resulted in the complete shutdown of my Google account. And that affected me pretty dramatically since I use Google Voice for my business and really with all my family and friends too. And that was shut down. And my Android phone didn't function correctly because the components that require the Google services shut down, like my calendars and things like that. So it was definitely a pain in the butt. And when I went to the log to see the location, it was from Hong Kong or something like that. I mean, it was from a China location.
Yeah, and I've heard the same anecdotal things from other people I know saying that I went to log into my Gmail one day and it said, hey, you're currently logged in from this random location in some country that you don't live in. Was that you? And you're like, no, and it logs them out or whatever, and you go and change your password, but it's like, how did they get in there in the first place?
Yeah, it's unsettling.
Yeah.
Any other things that we know about this story yet?
Yeah, specifically what the attackers were doing once they broke into the accounts was either setting up forwarding or delegation. So they'd either set it up to forward all new mail from now on to some other account so that these hackers could monitor the email that was coming in, or setting up delegation, which is giving a second person access to a Gmail account.
Right, so they could monitor it.
Right. That's a feature designed for things like companies that are using Gmail, where you can give multiple people access to one account. Right. And so, yeah, it would be giving the hacker would give themselves access to your account. Now, with those two particular settings, if you don't go and look at those settings, you wouldn't know what happened. And even if you change your account's password, those settings are still there unless you go in and change them and undo it.
Right, because it's not a password thing. It's a back-end sort of permissions thing.
So they're either going in and setting up forwarding or delegating a second username and password that can access your account. And with both of those things, that means that if you change your password, they would still see all of your email.
It also means, and of course this is just to be expected, but it also means that there is a built-in way to bypass your password to get access to your mailbox.
Yeah,
to the
you
system.
have to have the password the first time to get in there and change the setting.
Oh,
But
I don't.
To set up forwarding?
No. No, you have a Google Apps for Business, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that I swear to God, I've never actually tried it, but I swear I've seen not only in the administrator page, I've seen forwarding, but I've also seen open their mailbox. So I could actually just go in and click on it and open somebody's email box.
That's your domain though. That's not a regular Gmail account.
Right, but it's the same code. You know what I mean? It's the same. It's Gmail code.
Yeah.
It's just isolated for business.
I don't know that you could open someone else's email box. When we had to do that once with our Gmail thing, we had to reset the user's password and log in as them.
I could be wrong because I have no reason to ever try it. But yeah.
I think if Gmail used to have that feature, they might have taken it out to comply with the because they want the governments to start. They wanted government to start using
meet
Gmail
their requirements. Yeah.
apps. And remember, they filed a lawsuit against some state government because they chose to use Microsoft Exchange email server without comparing.
Without
it
even
to any
considering
other.
Google. Yeah.
Exactly.
Because of requirements is what they said.
Yeah, so Google, that's why Google put out that video we featured on one of our first episodes showing how they destroy old hard drives and stuff.
Yeah, if you are just joining TechSnap and haven't watched the first episode, we rolled some video footage of Google really going into a lot of detail about some of the physical security precautions they take.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting. Anything else on the Gmail story? That's all I really had on it.
But mostly it was just that they seem to be targeting people for political means.
Right.
Right. Targeting journalists so they could, find out information about their sources, or targeting, government officials to get whatever they wanted from there, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, the next story reminds us that it's not always high-profile companies like Google or Sony that get attacked, but sometimes it's I don't know if they're the little guy, but it's something like the PBS network gets hacked.
Right, but this one is particularly scary because of what could have happened.
Oh, do
Not
tell,
what
sir.
did happen, but what could have happened.
Tell me.
Well, first thing is LulzSec. If you
Yeah.
remember from last week, they were one of the groups that was responsible for one of the 10 Sony hacks.
Right.
They broke into the PBS website and managed to gain access to a number of parts of the website through the PBS content management system.
Oh, no
And
kidding.
So they accessed the database and published all the user login information for a bunch of users in the database.
Oh, including passwords?
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't know if this was people who had accounts for posting comments, that kind of thing, or if it was for people that were like editors on the website.
Yeah, they got their Twitter
They were
account too.
Apparently. But most, alarmingly, they were able to post fake news stories that appeared on the official PBS News website.
Oh, wow.
Now, in this case, they posted a fake news story about rapper Tupac Shakur, who died
That's funny.
whenever. And
In
they said he was
96.
still alive. Yeah, in 1996, and they said he was still alive and living at a resort in New Zealand.
Well, that's kind of funny.
Yeah, but they could have, posted malicious code into the news page, so everybody that viewed it got some malware.
Or they could have gone for a hot button topic like the nuclear reactor in Japan or something, and just stirred stuff
or
up.
they could have, put out some rumor about Apple and drove their stock price into the ground or something.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can remember when somehow accidentally Steve Jobs' obituary leaked out to the Reuters wire, right? Because they are always polishing up and having one ready for him, right?
Which is creepy.
Yeah. But that accidentally got out once, and it, caused quite a
Yep,
stir and
I
caused a
remember that.
big dip in the stock price. Well, if one of those got, a full story on the front page of PBS, they could have seriously, just evaporated millions of dollars in assets.
Well, and you got to wonder, where does their did that also then syndicate out to their RSS feeds? Where does that get published at? And
Exactly.
then what other places? Because that's one of the things that drives me crazy about online news is so many sites are just essentially pulling down RSS feeds and then repopulating into their news feeds and things like that. So you could really kind of have a snowball
Yeah,
effect in a way too.
Specifically reading about one of the stories we're talking about later, the RSA one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could read the story at Reuters, the BBC, the Washington Post, and MSN or MSNBC, and almost all of them have practically exactly the same text, right?
Yes.
They have the same quotes from the same people. So even they are recycling the same content. So if you get the fake news out there on PBS, then somebody on the CNN Twitter account's like, oh, they heard that first, so then they republish it, and then it spreads all over the internet, and it could do serious harm.
I want to bring something up. Neen in the chat room suggests that perhaps LulzSec is doing this to just highlight security flaws to the company, so that way they can correct it. I think we've gone beyond that now because you can do that without being public about it for one.
Yes, that's the proper thing that security researchers do. When they find
Right.
a problem, they do what's called
Yeah.
they notify the vendor about the problem and give them a certain amount of time to fix it, and then publish, or they publish right away,
Right.
explaining the problem, but they don't go and exploit it.
You know what I've done as a security contractor before is I'll put up a new private page that doesn't have anything bad on it, just hi from Chris, and then I'll say I was able to compromise your site. Go to this URL, and then there it is. Or it'll be
Right.
you can put it at the footer and at the bottom of the page, or you can even put a comment in HTML
Yeah.
source. There's a lot of ways you
Exactly.
can do
Things
it.
like that
Yeah.
are less destructive.
The other thing
also-
oh, go ahead.
Okay, LulzSec has come out and specifically said why they did it, so
Oh,
we don't have to speculate on
what
that
is
one.
that?
It was a protest against a PBS Frontline episode that was very critical of WikiLeaks.
Sticking up for their brethren, in a sense.
So we know exactly why they did it. We don't have to speculate.
Alan, and I know I beat this pretty much almost every episode now,
Mhm.
but did you see recently that there was a story from the U.S. government that they're going to consider cyber attacks a form of cyber terrorism and respond as if it was an act of war? Did you see that story? And
I didn't, but I wouldn't be surprised by that.
and I'm worried that what we are doing, not us, but what the people like LulzSec are doing are digging the grave that will bury the freedom of the internet. Not Not
Yeah.
that they're, of course, they're just exposing things that exist anyways that would eventually be exposed. But by being sort of attention whores and doing it for the lulz, they are waving a flag at an issue that the U.S. government is going to have to act, and they're essentially almost taunting them in a way, like they're screwing with the bowl, and they're flashing that red flag. And you got to figure too that you've got companies now, like you had game companies are saying they were losing millions of dollars because of Sony being down. Sony obviously will come out and say we've lost almost $500 million or something like that. All these PBS was seen as a news organization. Now they're attacking the news media. Obviously, they go after something else we're going to cover very soon in TechSnap's newsfeed. All of these things, Alan, I don't know. I feel like we're getting dug into a grave that's going to screw us all, and eventually.
Yeah. But it's not really Lulztech's fault. It's the fact that the government doesn't understand what's actually happening and is responding.
Do you want to talk about our next story? Because the next story plays directly into that.
Here's an exact example of this thing. So imagine the story we're going to talk about now. Taking much, much further and on a more serious topic.
This is almost a humorous but pathetic example of when they get it wrong and they try to legislate things they don't understand.
Exactly. This is about legislating things they don't understand.
So everybody remembers we talked about that cookie story and how they were going to make where you had to disclaim to somebody that you were tracking with a cookie, right, Alan? Is that essentially what that story was?
You had to get their permission to track them with a cookie.
This is coming out of the EU, and now it's in effect.
Yes. In the UK, I think some countries are doing it at different dates, but in the UK it is now in effect.
So, Alan, how do you so when you come to the site, it says, by the way, we're going to use cookies to track you. Are you okay with that? And they say yes. And once you go back to the site, it won't tell you that again because you've said yes. But, Alan, how can they do that?
They use a cookie. And you said yes, so that's fine. But so in this example, the message that came up said, because of a new law, we're going to have to ask you for your permission to store a cookie on you, but we haven't figured out how to do that without being annoying yet. And so stay tuned for an update or kind of thing. Right? Yeah,
this is funny. Notice to visitors.
They have this in a pop-up.
The law relating to website cookies changes on the 26th of May and requires cookies only be used with your consent. Radio Times is currently working on the best way to obtain your consent without spoiling your enjoyment of the website, and will notify you of these changes in due course. And then there it is.
Right. Now, the thing is, if you reload this page or come back later, that message does not appear because it uses a cookie to tell that you've already been shown that message.
Wow.
So it's using a cookie to keep track of whether you've seen the message about how they can't use cookies.
It has to, though. That's how the technology works. Unless you sign in every time you go to the website, and then they do like some sort of database token in the URL or something.
Right. So what this means is that they were using a cookie to tell whether or not you've been told about the fact that they need your consent to use cookies.
Ridiculous.
But they're using a cookie without your consent to ask for your consent to use a cookie. But basically in the future, without using something like the Do Not Track system that's built into the browsers, which is what you and I think they should use instead of a silly law that can't be implemented, users who decide not to accept a cookie, so if you don't agree to have them store the cookies on your computer and store an extra cookie to remember the fact that you agreed to let them store the cookies, that would mean that every time you go to the site, you're going to get this prompt saying, can we please use cookies on your computer? Because it can't store a cookie to remember that you said no.
Right.
So it would have to ask you every single time. And so eventually it would just bother you enough that you would eventually hit yes, please stop bugging me about the cookies, right? And this is why there's settings to control whether a website can keep a cookie on your computer in your browser.
Yeah.
If you don't want them to, go and change it over
there.
You
already have control over that.
But you will have the exact same problem that websites won't work without cookies.
It's kind of embarrassing. They obviously just don't understand.
Exactly. And so this is why the issue should have been left to the users and the browser manufacturers. Yeah. Rather than having it legislated by the government.
Well, and that's what's so adorable about their pathetic attempt is that the technology is already being built with the Do Not Track stuff to take care of it, and they've essentially only been able to less elegantly implement something that's already built in every browser, and that's the ability to just turn off cookies.
Yeah.
And on top of that, there is an active cookie cleaning market on the Windows side and on every browser.
Every browser now has some form of private browsing mode.
Yes.
Where the cookies are stored temporarily, but once you switch off the private browsing mode, they're all gone. And that's the way the do not track system is going to work. Is it's still going to store cookies. It's just you're not going to create the relationships between the sessions and allow the cookies to last for very long.
I like. I don't know how
you still need some cookies. It's inevitable.
I don't know how you pronounce the name, but Ormaj or Maj, he says, well, there's always Flash cookies. So there you go. That's true. Could always use Flash cookies.
Actually, something I meant to talk about a couple weeks ago is the new version of Flash 10.3 gives users more privacy settings about Flash cookies.
Well, how about that?
Because a lot of people were concerned with how much data was being stored in Flash cookies. So the newest version of Adobe Flash 10.3 has more settings to let you control the privacy of your Flash cookies.
Well, I like it when that happens. That's actually really nice. That's good.
Well, that's how it should have been handled, not some silly law by people who don't understand it.
I agree.
So the law is unenforceable. It's unimplementable. They've admitted this and said, well, we'll give everybody at least a year before we actually start, monitoring it.
For the crackdown.
And they have to figure out how they're going to manage to do that.
Well, they got a year to figure it out, and hopefully in that year they'll figure it out that it's just not going to work. Because you're right, it's unenforceable.
And they'll just repeal the law because it's ridiculous.
Are you ready for our last news story before we get to the Q&A?
Yeah.
All right. Now, this one is essentially a follow-up to something we covered in TechSnap episode 2. Alan, I'll let you set it up, but just as a reminder to folks, it was never officially confirmed. It was one of those political denial, non-denial type releases from the RSA camp saying that they might have been compromised, data might have been stolen, but, that's not what's important. What's important is that you take steps to make sure that people never are able to get your tokens and never able to do this or that, and you want to make sure your usernames and passwords you're using with those tokens are super secure, remember? And that was kind of like their way of saying, yeah, we have a problem, but... Now
we had more specifics.
We did.
When we
I don't remember.
Snack 002, we talked about how some specific data was taken. They managed to export it to a staging server and actually download it.
Oh, that's right.
Remember using a compromised web server, and then they erased that compromised web server to break the chain back to them.
You know what?
They were never specific about exactly what was stolen. All they said it was information that could cause secure IDs to be less secure.
Yeah. But I think we have kind of confirmation that there was I mean, I'll let you go ahead and take the story.
Yeah.
Set it up.
So a number of defense contractors like Lockheed Martin have had their internal secure networks compromised using duplicates of their RSA secure IDs. So if you remember, the secure IDs are physical tokens.
Yeah.
And basically using information they stole from RSA and what appears to be other information they stole through malware, phishing, and other attacks on Lockheed Martin, they managed to duplicate one or more of these RSA secure IDs, and with that, be able to gain access to the secure network.
Well, now, and they would, you can't get in with just the token.
Right. Normally, you either need the token and a PIN number,
right,
or in the PayPal and WoW model, it's username, password, and the token's key.
So they would have had to have not only been able to generate the correct token, but also through, like you mentioned, the phishing attempts, they must have somehow also acquired their standard credentials as well.
Yeah.
And they, of course, haven't released any information on how that might have actually taken place.
Right. And so they're not saying at all what data may have been exposed or stolen. And it's unlikely they'll ever say because the information is, quite sensitive. Right? It's information about the design and manufacture of new arms systems.
Yeah, it's the exact kind of compromise that's going to make the U.S. government call it an act of terrorism.
Yeah, in this case, it could actually be an act of espionage, but the same idea. Yeah, this is, things about weapon systems, which, are obviously... so the secure ID is, if you don't remember, it's the two-factor authentication system. And the idea is that with regular username and password, if somebody has a keylogger on your machine, they would get your username and password and be able to use it later. By using something like one of these RSA tokens that has a key that changes, I think mine's every 8 seconds or something like that, that if they did manage to log it, by the time they went to use it, it would be different and they wouldn't be able to log in.
Yeah, I've had my experience has been in the medical field. A lot of doctors that will work at a large hospital, but then also have their own offices with their own practices. Mm-hmm. When they need to consult on a case that's happening back at the hospital, there's a lot of like SSL VPN setups that they'll use it with Citrix or something like that, and they authenticate to those portals using a username, a password, and the RSA token.
Yeah.
And I think it was TechSnap episode 1, we talked about a semi-comparable system that Google offers if you have a smartphone, where you can kind of turn your smartphone into a token generator.
Right, where they will text message you the token.
Yeah, and then you can use that to log into your Google accounts if you're worried about it being compromised. And it's something I'm seriously considering using, actually.
Yeah, especially with our first story that people are breaking into Google accounts.
Yeah. I didn't mean to derail you. Any other notes on the story?
Senior defense officials from the Department of Defense and the Pentagon have said that while the contractor networks contain sensitive data, all classified data is stored in a separate closed network managed by the U.S. government. Now, it doesn't say whether that was compromised or not,
right.
But, obviously if Lockheed Martin had access to that, and these people had access to Lockheed Martin's network, they could have, island hopped their way into this secure U.S. government network.
Yeah, who knows?
But they would never admit that if it did happen.
Right.
Also, the Pentagon has come out and said that they do use a number of RSA tokens, but they wouldn't say how many. And we're not sure now whether those are compromised as well or not.
Well, and again, they'd still have to have the username and password to go with it.
Usually.
So, as long as, they don't have that. Although it doesn't seem like that's ever been the big stumbling block on any of this stuff. You know what I mean?
That's the whole point of the second factor, is that the username and password are the easiest to get.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's, Mm-hmm.
So apparently the hackers learned how to duplicate the secure ID tokens using information they stole during their advanced persistent threat attack on RSA, like we talked about in episode number 2.
So they somehow they figured out how the secret sauce works.
Right, which means it obviously wasn't that secure if it was only secure because no one knew how it worked.
Seems like the crown jewels. If they were able to get that, if you were able to compromise the network and get that,
it seems to me that meant that it was security by obscurity.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't a secure system. It was just a secret system.
Something they could invent.
And once somebody figured out how it worked, they were able to break it. So that leaves the biggest question is whether the secure ID system can be fixed, or if it's entirely broken and would have to be redesigned, and everybody would have to get new tokens. Because according to RSA, they have produced 250 million of these tokens in use all over the world.
How can it not be broken at this point? I mean, if these guys are able to generate,
if they only were able to, discern the private key of a few tokens by specifically phishing these users, then, but it does seem that it's broken. Yes, there's no way that the token should be that easy to duplicate.
That would be my main concern. Yeah, is that even
it seems to me that if it was based on real, public key cryptography, the only way to duplicate it would be to have the private key, right? There's some information is being leaked somewhere, by this, there's something wrong with the system if by looking at a series of the numbers it generates, you can somehow come up with the algorithm or whatever.
It strikes me it's a pretty old system. It's been around for a long time. So
that too.
Who knows exactly the math that the math they probably originally invented to do the calculation is probably not all that strong compared to what we can calculate now at rapid speeds.
And so it's very likely that we'll see a lot more about this in the next little while.
Interesting. I'm sure we'll follow up in the future TechSnap. All right, are you ready to move on to the Q&A?
Yep.
All right, just a reminder to people, email us techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com if you want to get your question or if you want to make a recommendation for the show onto TechSnap, and we'll feature them right here. And all right, Alan, I will get to the first question. And I'm sorry if I get the pronunciation wrong on any of these, but Swadine wrote in and said, what are the differences between virtualization that we do on our home PC and the virtualization that you do on enterprise servers? It's a good question.
Yeah. Mostly the virtualization that's used in an enterprise is very much the same as what you're doing at home. A lot of it's even the same software.
VMware would disagree. They'd say, oh, no, ESX is a custom platform with a optimized Linux kernel that has been designed for bare metal performance.
Right. So sometimes when they use that, what it means is that there's no host OS or a very, very small one
Right.
under the machine. So you're not running a whole copy of Windows. So that means that much more of the CPU and the RAM and so on can go to the virtual machines instead of the host machine.
Yeah.
But one of the main differences is in an enterprise, they'll have more than one server doing the virtualization. Right? So they'll be running, say, 100 virtual machines spread across 20 real machines.
Yes.
And part of that is when they use what's called shared storage. That doesn't mean using, just one hard drive for everything, but it means using something like iSCSI.
Just like I diagrammed in my war story in last week's episode.
Exactly. Using a system like that, where there's a single place where all the files are stored.
Yep.
That's common to all of the virtual machine masters, hosts. And what that allows you to do is to what's called live migrate a virtual machine.
Yes.
So if you have, say, a bunch of servers running your virtual machines, and a bunch of them get really busy on one of the machines, you can pause one of the busy ones and migrate it over to another machine. So basically you take a snapshot of its RAM and copy it over to the other machine. Then you copy the differences between when you started the snapshot and what it is now to catch up. And then basically you pause the machine for a second, boot it up on the other one, and unpause it and pick up exactly where you left off.
Yeah, that's not really a task that a home user would need to do very often. I'll give you another example is resource limiters. You can on enterprise types of virtualization, you can put limits on how much CPU a single host can take. You can kind of do it in an extent with your home stuff, but literally the percentage or the exact gigahertz you want it to be able to go to, those kinds of things. And then you can also, they have API sets and command interfaces opened up, so you can write scripts so that if your server room gets too warm, you can auto shut down certain servers first. They have these tool sets available to them. Those kinds of things.
Exactly. Yeah. And another thing that you can do is using those APIs to manage the number of machines you're using. So when the load is very low, there's not a lot happening, you can move all the virtual machines onto just 3 or 4 of your machines and shut the rest of them off and save the electricity.
Yep.
And then if the load picks up, then you can slowly turn more and more machines on and spread the load out more and more. And basically, instead of having a bunch of machines running 2 virtual machines each and being about 10% utilized, you keep a bunch of them near, say, 60% utilization and the rest of them off so that you're not wasting electricity and overburdening your cooling system for no reason.
This is one of the reasons I like, I don't know if it's the best product on the market. I'm not going to call it that, but one of the reasons I like VirtualBox is it really has no incentive to differentiate itself from the enterprise version and the consumer version. So it's you have 2 different camps coming at VirtualBox, making it a really good product. One of the things, did you know VirtualBox has an RDP support? For any guest OS, you can open up a remote desktop connection to the console through the Microsoft Remote Desktop client of a VirtualBox guest.
That's
super
only
handy.
In the pay version.
Yeah.
The free version has the same thing, but with only
you don't
with
have to
VNC.
pay; it's just commercial.
Right, sorry. But the open source version has the same thing, but uses VNC.
Yep.
And it doesn't support very strong authentication.
Right.
But it does give you that feature if you need it.
Yeah, it's called
And
the
that can
non-open
be very
source
handy.
edition.
Yeah. And that can be very handy, especially, if you need to reinstall the OS.
You can reinstall the
I use
entire
it 'cause-
OS remotely.
Because
It's great.
my virtual machines mostly run on servers in data centers, so I use that to be able to install the OS until I can get up. And once it's up, then I can SSH into the virtual machine and do everything there.
Well, and
I need
keeping
console access, that makes a big difference.
one of the things you do on a server version is you like Alan touched on, is you keep the base OS super lean, because any bit of memory that the base operating system is using is essentially less memory or processor you could dedicate to the guest OS. So you take something you could take a really thin BSD or Linux install and then load VirtualBox Headless Edition on top of that.
Yep.
And then not even have a GUI to run your virtual machines.
Exactly. That's what I use.
And VirtualBox is just one of many VMwares out there, KVM and Zen. There's lots out there.
Yeah, because before VirtualBox got support for BSD, I was using QEMU.
Oh, yeah.
Which is partly what VirtualBox is based on. And that's actually the software that came up with the idea of that VNC console idea.
Yeah.
And
that's where they got that from.
We didn't talk about it on this show. I don't know if you got to talk about it on last or not, but the guy that invented QEMU recently invented a virtualization system to run Linux only in JavaScript in your browser.
We did. It was my runs Linux pick.
Yes.
Yeah. That's awesome. It's actually a Linux environment in JavaScript.
Right.
It's pretty cool.
So that's the main difference with the enterprise virtualization, is the ability to move the virtual machines between physical hosts and to control everything with scripts so that you can control exactly how many physical hosts are powered on and how much, and spread the load out between them and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, it lets you have high availability.
Yes.
Right? If you're using physical machines and some hard drives break or whatever, or a fan breaks, whatever, you have to shut the machine off and fix it. If you're using this system and you have all your machines virtualized, running on all these physical machines, if one of those breaks down, you migrate the machines off of it, you can shut it down, take it out, pull it apart, fix it, and put it back in, and then migrate load back to it without affecting the virtual machines.
One of the other really great advantages to enterprise virtualization like that is a lot of them have built-in machine duplication or templating. So you can just say, take this virtual machine and make a template of it, which is awesome because then you can load testing software on there, or if you just need another machine with similar functionality like that.
Yeah, you can just duplicate them really easily, and you can deploy as many as you need, and there's just so many things that make it.
My biggest revelation with virtualization was once we had a nice environment set up was when somebody would come down with a project that required deployment of a server in the past, that automatically had a 3-week delay on it, meaning that I had to order the hardware, get it approved, and then get it shipped.
Yep.
That could take almost a month sometimes with bureaucracy and whatnot. With the virtual machine, as long as the resources are in place, it's 15 minutes.
Yeah, if you have the capacity, then and if you have a template, then it really cuts down that overhead. And maybe next week we can get to that question somebody asked, what are some things that you should not virtualize?
Yeah, that would be good. Are you ready for the next question?
I can think of one or two, but I'd rather spend a little time on it and come up with a good list.
Yeah, I was thinking about it myself. I'll tell you one thing that I thought I'd never virtualize that I'm actually trying at the moment is Bitcoin generation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have my results on that. I'm trying to
I bet that's going to be bad.
I would think so, right? Unless
because anything involving cryptography has generally been quite bad in virtualization.
That's what I would think. I'm going to give it a shot.
Because I might be able to come up with a war story on that one.
Oh, interesting.
It's not a real war story, but a little one.
Okay. All right, are you ready for the next question?
I am.
All right, Alexander writes in. He says, I'm building a new home network for my roommate, so that's cool. And I'm at college. We plan to build a virtualization server as described in the Build Your Own Cloud episode of Last that we just had recently. But I have a few questions. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Question number 1, and I'll just let you answer, and then when you're done, I'll go to the next one. Should I buy a managed or unmanaged switch?
Most likely, you don't need a managed switch.
Yeah.
They provide a lot of features like VLANs and trunking and rate limiting and all these things, but this is for your house, not for a server room, so you probably don't need it.
Get a gigabit, and get a lot of ports, but don't go managed.
He was looking at a 20 or 40 port gigabit switch. He said he was looking at.
See, and managed, that could be as much as $3-4 grand.
Yeah, we got semi-managed ones for like $900 for 24 port gigabit.
24s, yeah.
Yeah, you can get 24 port unmanaged for hundreds of dollars less, and you really don't need those features.
You don't. You really don't.
If you had one and you wanted to do it just for fun, then you can do things like VLANs, where you're creating multiple separate networks as if they were separate switches, and preventing broadcast packets from crossing your different domains, and doing like a DMZ for your servers, and then one LAN for each roommate or whatever if they have multiple machines each. But really, you don't need it, and you'll save hundreds of dollars by just getting an unmanaged switch.
Absolutely. Are you ready for the second question of his overall question? He says, should I build a virtualization server and a storage server, or one that functions as both?
Well, like we talked about earlier, if you have the separate storage server, then that's when you can do that thing with virtualization, with moving the virtual machines. But if you're only going to have one virtualization server, it's not going to really save you anything.
Right, unless maybe you wanted to be able to have more virtualization servers later if it grew.
Right, but this is for your house, so you're probably not going to need that.
Probably not.
Right?
You never know. He sounds pretty ambitious.
Yeah, the virtualization server doesn't need to be high availability, and it doesn't have to be all that high performing. If you're like me, you were using the virtualization to do your networking labs or whatever for school, right? It was not about production environment. So I would say you could save a lot of money by just putting all your storage in your virtualization server.
Yeah, and I think perhaps, I mean, if you did want to go with some sort of storage, I just want to make a recommendation to FreeNAS. They just revved to a new version 2, which is looking really great. I talked to some of the guys from FreeNAS at Linux Fest this year. They told me what they're doing, and it's awesome. I'm gonna try to get time to look at it. But I think, first of all, your approach is a little wrong here. I would say, as Alexander, right? Yeah, Alexander, I would say the approach is a little wrong because I would say with virtualization, go all in or don't go. And I don't know exactly what you're using the virtualization for, but I would say virtualize everything or nothing. So that way you don't end up with, like, we have these virtual servers here, and then we have this nice, massive media pool storage right here, but our media pool keeps getting bigger and bigger, and now it's bumping up against the partition that our virtual machines are on, or vice versa. I would probably just say make everything virtual storage. Use the entire disk for virtual drives, and then just splice up that storage into virtual disks. So, if you spin up a media server at some point, allocate some of that space on that huge drive with a virtual media server drive and use that, because you can expand those virtual images. Just make sure you do it right, but you can expand those virtual images if you need to grow.
Right.
And or don't do storage or don't do virtualization. If you're just going to host like a game server and a file server and a streaming server, you might just want to go a native box. I mean, don't make it more complicated than you have to. That way, when you want to have fun, you don't have to tinker with stuff. Unless you want to.
And,
you could go FreeNAS, iSCSI, and go to town.
Right. And
or Drobo.
Because if you do just the native box, like you were saying, and you need to do a bit of virtualization, you can just put VirtualBox on there or whatever.
Yeah, you could just then add VirtualBox if you need it.
Yeah. Because he was also talking about using something like pfSense for a firewall.
Oh, I love pfSense.
Yeah.
And I love FreeNAS too, though. So what can I say? I'm a little stuck. All right, third part of this.
BSD, it works.
Yeah.
Both of those are BSD.
They are, aren't they? Yeah. So the third part of his question is, how much power would you think a system like this would draw?
Actually, that's depends a lot, but it won't actually be that bad. When you go to buy the server, the specs should tell you about how much power it'll draw, but the hard drives don't draw all that much. You're talking when they're idle, like 3 to 8 watts maybe.
Yeah.
And even at full load, I think usually it's about 15 watts is the max for a hard drive.
Yeah.
So even if you put a whole bunch in it,
unless they're like 10,000 RPM.
Yeah. But I think he was going for terabytes of storage, not speed. So.
Yeah.
So the hard drives don't draw all that much. A regular quad-core CPU is usually about between 94 and 135 watts, depending if it's the Core 2 type or an i7 type. The Core 2 quad type or the i7 type.
Yeah.
But there's also low-power versions of processors.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually a little bit slower on the gigahertz side, but they're more in like the 60-watt range.
And the advantage is not just with that, is not just power draw, but then also less cooling requirements, which means it can run quieter, which is something to consider.
But the CPU is significantly more expensive.
And slower.
Yeah, so it's less speed for even more money.
But if it's a file server, you don't need speed. If it's a virtualization server, I honestly would probably be looking at like an i7 or an i5.
Yeah, well, I think he's looking at the Xeon type of an i7, but yes.
Yeah, that's probably overkill, to be honest.
Yeah, but he seemed to specifically want, like,
hey, maybe they're pooling their funds together and they're going to go for the gold.
Yeah, they were looking at like a Dell server rather than like building their own.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, and another thing is servers tend to have higher efficiency power supplies. Like when I built our servers, we specifically picked out 80-plus certified power supplies that are guaranteed to be at least 80% efficient, which means less of the power they draw from your AC circuit is exhausted as waste heat, right? It means more of the power gets used and less gets wasted.
Right.
So a high efficiency power supply will lower your power demand. And they just tend to be better and last longer as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And they're designed. I mean, the nice thing about going with an actual server is it's just the mindset at the beginning of the design process is this will run 24/7 and be under various loads.
And yeah, exactly.
All right, next part of the question. This is the last part of the question. He says, how would I run multiple web servers in my network and have them all accessible to the outside world with only one external IP address? Well, there's a couple ways to do that.
Yeah, and that's kind of gets a little tricky. The traditional way would be you'd have to run each web server on a different port.
Yeah.
But that's cumbersome, especially for the users, because they have to know which port has which site and remember it. And
Which is handy if you want a site that not a lot of people will go to. Like if you're trying to put something up you don't want people to get to without knowing how.
Right. But you shouldn't trust that either.
What about like Apache Virtual Server or something like that?
Well, all web servers have built-in support for what's called virtual hosts, where they look at the header of the request to figure out which website you're looking for.
Based on the DNS request.
Yeah.
Or the DNS name.
HTTP, yeah, the host name in the HTTP request. And that's how regular Apache web servers tell which website you're asking for, right? That's how you can host 100 websites on one web server with one IP address. But if you want each of those to go to a different virtual machine, or for example, you have a Windows IIS web server doing something and then a Linux Apache web server, then that doesn't work there.
Right.
So what you do is you can put something in front, so something listing on the IP like Nginx or Lady, and do a reverse proxy. So Nginx will listen on port 80 for all the connections into any of your web servers, and then either based on the host name or based on the directory, right? So you'd have one domain name for your IP address.
How do you spell Nginx? Is it Nginx?
Nginx.org is the website.
Right. I'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah. So basically what you would do there is either based on the host names, so you get a different host name for each web server, or based on the directory. So you do like myhomeserver.com/server1/server2, whatever. So based on one of those, you would reverse proxy to a different internal IP address. So as far as the user is concerned, they would see a regular website, but you basically have this reverse proxy making a decision about which internal server to route the request to.
And that's exactly on the war story I shared last TechSnap 7. That's exactly how I direct traffic inbound to a virtual network. Is I inherited the setup and it uses Squid, and I don't like using Squid for that.
Squid's meant to go the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a client-side proxy, not server-side.
My challenge becomes now is they want to offer SSL for one of the sites behind it, and I don't know how to do that in the environment where the name actually resolves to Squid. So now I have to go through all this process of trying to figure that out. It's a pain in the butt.
With SSL, you have to have separate IP addresses for each separate host name, or you have to be absolutely sure that all the clients accessing your thing support the new SSL extension that passes the host name as well. Nginx supports reading that, but only like really new browsers do. And usually you have to support older stuff. So really you need a separate IP address for each SSL hostname.
Yeah.
Because SSL happens before HTTP, and so that host header that you normally do your virtual hosting on happens after.
One thing to remember if you're running a web server at home is, that is now a potential point of exploit for someone to get into your home network from the internet.
Yes. Also, that's against many ISPs' terms of service.
Or college campus.
Yeah.
One thing, though, to consider is, what would you think, Alan, of something like there's the, what's that EC2 free cloud? You can do like an EC2 instance for free for a year?
Oh, yeah. Amazon has an EC2 thing, and you get their very, very smallest virtual machine 24/7 for a year.
Yeah, and you might be able to do something like that, or even like a cheap GoDaddy system.
But I think for these guys, what their plan was to use it to store media and stuff in their house, and then I guess they would just have a web server on it.
Yeah,
they were looking at getting a fairly serious internet connection. So.
Oh, cool.
Like a 50 by 50 fiber, they said.
So I got a link to the reverse proxy that he could use to accomplish that. So that was a great story.
That's probably what you should look at for in replacing Squid.
I know,
Nginx is better at it, and it has support for SSL.
That's kind of what I
can show you how to
gathered.
do it. It's like 2 lines of config, and SSL is ready to go.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, all right. Now you got my interest, Alan.
Actually, what I was just saying about you need a separate IP address. If you were doing subdomains of a main domain, you can get one of those wildcard certificates, and then you would be able to get away with it. Right? If there were 2 different subdomains based on the same real domain,
right?
Then the one certificate would cover both, and you'd be able to do the virtual hosting after the
That
SSL
would work
step.
for their setup. That wouldn't work for my setup. That because it is just one domain. But that would probably be the way to go for most people. There you go.
Yeah,
I like that.
It wouldn't work for web hosting when you're doing a whole bunch of different sites. But if you were doing 2 different subdomains of the same site, you could get away with one IP address.
Yeah. There you go. Now, are you ready for our first viewer-submitted war story?
Sure.
All
Do
right,
you want to
now-
read this one?
Yeah, sure. I'll read it to you. Or do you want to read it? You can if you want.
I can. It doesn't.
Because I just read
you
the
can have it
why
here.
don't you? I'll let you read it because I just read all the questions, and people probably get sick of hearing my voice.
I just answered all the questions.
Oh,
Sick
all
of
right.
my-
That's a good point. I'll read it. I was building a new Windows 2008 R2 server, which, speaking of
forgot-
virtualization, a lot of people like Hyper-V, and that comes on Server 2008 R2, and I've used Hyper-V in the past and have actually been pretty impressed.
You forgot to mention who sent in the war story.
Stay Frosty.
Yes.
Stay Frosty sent in the war story. He says, so anyways, I recovered that. Building a new 2008 R2 server for a small business client of mine. The machine was a little more than a glorified desktop, but it had a support contract. After installing the OS, I started installing the drivers and noticed that there was a BIOS update. I figured since the machine was not in production yet, I might as well install that too. I think that's probably the exact thought process I would go through. During the flashing process, one of the steps failed. I flipped the KVM over to use a different machine to research the problem. While doing so, I heard the fans in the server spin down and then back up. The machine had rebooted automatically to install some Windows updates. When I flipped the KVM back, nothing but a black screen.
Uh-oh.
Luckily, when I contacted the hardware provider, they told me about the BIOS recovery jumper, and I was able to get the machine back online. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
And he said the key things here to take away that are the stress factors, client of mine. So he's there doing work for a client, and you're setting it up, and if when you're in the situation where it's one of these servers that's a desktop class servers, that means the client is cheap. And that means that he just broke their server, and I bet he was sweating bullets for a few minutes.
Yeah, because basically you're flashing the BIOS, you do it wrong. The BIOS is normally because he was hadn't rebooted yet. He would have, if Windows Update hadn't rebooted the server for him, because certain critical updates will force a reboot.
Yes.
If that hadn't happened, he might have had a chance to try again to flash it and save it.
Yeah.
But he hadn't, and once the machine's in that state, you could be in big trouble. Luckily now, most newer motherboards have two BIOS chips.
Yeah.
One read-only and the one main one. And so that in this situation exactly, you can fall back to that second one. Some have a jumper and some do it automatically. But luckily he was able to get the machine back online.
Back when...
nothing worse than a company that's cheap and can't afford a real server or won't spend the money on a real server, and then you break their only server.
Yeah, I used to try to avoid the firmware updates as much as possible, but there was a few times where I got noticed that, hey, people are losing data like to drive controller firmware updates.
Yep.
And so it's one of those things where you always roll the dice when you do it, but you just have to do it.
And you're sweating bullets and you got your fingers crossed the whole time because this could totally pooch everything.
Yeah, pooch, exactly. It totally could. All right, Alan. Well, you know what? That's the last story we have today in this episode of TechSnap. Now, we want to hear your war stories, your questions, and your topic suggestions. So send those into techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com. And also, don't forget, if you want to stay current on the show, go over to facebook.com/jupiterbroadcasting. And we also have a discussion forum over at jupitercolony.com. So we've got all kinds of places. And you can watch the show and join the chat room and give us your thoughts while we go. I always try to keep an eye on this during TechSnap over at jblive.tv. And that's at 1 p.m. Pacific on Thursdays. And we're now releasing this show on Fridays. I have to try to get it out Friday morning so that way you have the whole weekend to enjoy it. Right?
Yep. And the other thing you want to mention is with the war stories. If you send in your war story, we might even ask you to come on the show and talk about it.
Yeah, we might start taking your Skype calls and get your war story in the flesh. If you have a webcam and a mic and or want to do that when you send in your war story, mention maybe in the email that you wouldn't mind Skyping in, and we'll set up a time with you over email and get you on here and let you share it with us. Yeah. All right. Well, that's all. That's everything, right, Alan?
Yep.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for watching this episode of TechSnap, and we'll see you next week.
Next week.